battlecruiser HMS New Zealand is the most awesome vessel ever purchased by New Zealand. Imagine being on the great ship as men shoveled nearly a ton of coal a minute into its 32 boilers during the First World War. Imagine the vibration, the smoke and the concussion as a quarter of a ton of explosive flung a shell the weight of a small car from each of her 8 12-inch guns. And 30 seconds later, the same again. How did a nation of only 1 million people have such a vessel in an age when cars were a rarity? Steam had just established its supremacy over sail in world trade, and the Wright brothers were still refining the principles of powered flight.
Sea power in the form of the Royal Navy had enabled Great Britain to gain and hold the largest empire in history. New Zealand had an emerging national identity, but we saw ourselves as part of this greater whole, and we were patriotic subjects of the King.
Germany in particular was resentful that as the biggest industrial power in the world, its trade took place at the pleasure of the British, and had since 1898 been building its high seas fleet into a force capable of challenging the Royal Navy.
In 1906, Britain launched the Dreadnought, the ship that was to lend its name to a whole generation of battleships. Armed with 10 305mm guns and turbine engines capable of driving the ship at an unprecedented 21 knots, the Dreadnought represented a turning point in warship design, and on her launch she rendered all other battleships in the world obsolete, including those of the Royal Navy.
The German naval scare of 1909 was symptomatic of the mood of the time. The ensuing rush of national fervour resulted in the British government ordering 6 dreadnoughts. This reaction extended to the uttermost ends of the empire.
There is at the present moment a crisis in the affairs of the empire. I propose that we should offer to the British government at least 1, and if necessary 2, first-class battleships of the Dreadnought or latest types, and that the offer should be on behalf of New Zealand and at our own cost. The battleships being controlled both in peace and wartime absolutely by the British Admiralty. Sir Joseph Ward, Premier.
Cabinet was unanimous, and the offer was forwarded to the British. 2 days later, the government of King Edward VII accepted.
The government and people of New Zealand are much gratified by the acceptance of their offer.
The New Zealand was built as one of the 3 ships of the Indefatigable class of battlecruisers, the third being HMAS Australia, ordered shortly after the New Zealand. Construction began at the Fairfield shipyards in 1910, and HMS New Zealand was completed in November 1912. It cost New Zealanders £1,800,000 to be paid in the form of a sinking fund, 16 times our annual defence budget at the time, to be serviced at a rate of £72,000 a year. A good annual salary of the period was £100.
The battlecruiser New Zealand was a development of the dreadnought concept. A vessel with the guns of a dreadnought, but much faster to destroy enemy armoured cruisers. To mount this armament and achieve speeds of over 25 knots, the boilers and machinery needed meant they were considerably larger than dreadnoughts. The turbines were powered by coal, shovelled by hand, and even cruising at 1/5 power, the New Zealand used over 200 tonnes a day. This size, speed and armament made them awesome. It was indeed the most expensive and admired class of ship afloat.
There was a problem, however. Despite its much greater size, considerable armour protection had to be sacrificed. This lack of armour would in time lend the battlecruiser class an infamous reputation. They were heavyweights with glass jaws.
Although under the command of the Royal Navy, it was expected that the New Zealand was to be the flagship of the China Pacific Squadron, and that as many of the crew as possible would be from New Zealand. To the disappointment of the government, this was not to be.
HMS New Zealand only visited New Zealand twice, in 1913 and 1919.
The public of New Zealand got their first look on April the 12th, 1913. During 10 weeks in New Zealand, something like half the population flocked to view the great ship. The battlecruiser received tumultuous welcomes wherever she went. Who could not have been awed by so tangible an impression of imperial power? It was widely agreed that the huge investment had been a wise one.
The ship acquired a Maori pew-pew cloak and a greenstone tiki to be worn by the captain when the ship was in action. It turned out that all precautions were needed, and the crew were lucky that the captain respected the spirit of the gift and did exactly that.
HMS New Zealand was to have a distinguished and lucky battle record during the war. In 3 major surface engagements, she emerged unscathed each time.
It was intended to raid German patrols off Heligoland with light forces and have heavy cover provided by a squadron of battlecruisers, including New Zealand. With the British engaged in a confused and murderous melee with German forces and a danger of Germany's own battlecruisers becoming involved, Admiral Beatty took his ships inshore to prevent the attacking force being overwhelmed.
Their arrival was decisive, and 2 German cruisers were quickly destroyed, and Beatty led the force to safety. It was a heartening victory at that time to the public.
A German raiding force centred around 3 battlecruisers plus the hybrid heavy cruiser Blucher was intending to bombard the Yorkshire coast. But British intelligence had cracked the German naval codes, and Admiral Beatty was waiting for them with a powerful battlecruiser force again, including the New Zealand. Light forces clashed first. Then the German commander, Admiral Hunter, fearing the raid compromised, ordered a swing around to return to port.
His apprehension saved his squadron, as Beatty's force was only 25 kilometres away and steaming at top speed, so a stern chase began, and soon British salvos had found the range and were inflicting heavy damage, particularly on the Blucher, which was slower than the other German ships. Less than 2 hours after the battle began, the situation looked grim for the Germans against the much more powerful British squadron. When Beatty's flagship received a hit, reducing her speed to 15 knots and cutting electric power, Beatty was unable to wireless his squadron. To his frustration, misreading of signals led his forces to concentrate fire on the doomed Blucher, enabling Hipper's mauled battle cruisers to escape.
This was to be Armageddon Day for the battlecruiser. In the only full-scale fleet engagement of the war, the British Grand Fleet and battlecruiser force had 37 capital ships, the German High Seas Fleet 21. There were more than 250 ships and 100,000 men on both sides.
Again, naval intelligence enabled the British to surprise the German force. The British battlecruisers under Beatty met the German battlecruisers under Admiral Hunter. In the ensuing engagement, first the Indefatigable, a sister ship to HMS New Zealand, and then the Queen Mary, suffered devastating magazine explosions. There were only 9 survivors.
The German ships had been hit hard too, and fell back on the High Seas Fleet, commanded by Admiral Scheer. His fleet began to pursue Beatty's force to the north, straight into the path of the Grand Fleet under Admiral Jellicoe. Grand was an apt word for this force. 28 dreadnought and super dreadnought battleships were in wait. Imagine Scheer's horror to see the horizon lined with enemy ships, guns flashing.
Just as the 2 fleets clashed, a 3rd battlecruiser, the Invincible, blew up in another magazine explosion, with only 6 survivors. But the High Seas Fleet was in a desperate position and faced annihilation. Scheer's ships were being hit again and again. Scheer executed the now famous battle turn-away manoeuvre, reversing course and disappearing into the haze and falling night to eventually reach safety.
In a sense, Jutland was a tactical defeat for the British in terms of losses, and certainly a major disappointment as they had come so close to destroying the High Seas Fleet. But it was also a strategic victory. The High Seas Fleet never again played any part in the war. An American journalist explained it the best. The prisoner has assaulted his jailer, but is still in prison.
The New Zealand was hit once on X turret, but there were no casualties or serious damage. A new dinner gong for the ship was fashioned from splinter-damaged plating.
When one considers the effect of similar hits on battle cruisers that day, you have to conclude that she was indeed a lucky ship.
On August the 20th, 1919, the New Zealand paid its last visit, the ship's Mana High from a distinguished war record. She was also flying the flag of Jellicoe, now a Viscount and Admiral of the Fleet. As on the first visit, huge crowds greeted the ship wherever she went, and there was an endless round of receptions staged to commemorate the ship and to honour the sailors and their Commander-in-Chief. When the ship returned to Britain, it was placed in reserve. The end was not far off. Jutland had exposed the tragic lack of armouring in the battlecruiser, and New Zealand was one of the first generation of such ships, smaller and slower than later versions.
So, in 1922, HMS New Zealand was hauled up onto a beach at Rosyth to be cut up for scrap. By 1923, she had ceased to exist. Today, the New Zealand is remembered by a few minutes of film, many photographs, books and a number of artefacts such as the guns outside the Auckland War Memorial Museum. The ship, though, has largely faded from our consciousness. That's a pity, as it is a significant chapter in our story and deserves better. Thanks to debt rescheduling during the Great Depression, payment for HMS New Zealand was only completed in 1945, 22 years after she had vanished.